In this tutorial, we'll learn everything you need to know to make amazing forms in React with input validation using React Hook Form. We'll take a look at the problems with basic forms, how React Hook Form fixes them, and the most important features as we build a production quality login form. The form will have multiple fields, robust validations with error messages, and even a loading state while we make an actual API call. So without much further ado, let's get started. Before we take a look at React Hook Form, it's important to understand the issues with basic forms in React as they come out of the box. So on the right hand side, we have a sign-in page with an email and a password input and a sign-in button. The way by keeping track of these values is through these two stateful variables, email and password, and then we plug them into the input over here. So the value is equal to the email and on change is set email. And similarly for the password, where the value is password and set password. The first issue, of course, is that if you add any more input fields, you would have to add another stateful variable. And this is not really scalable if you have a huge form with multiple pages to it. The next issue is with validations. So if we try to enter something, which is not an email and sign in, we do see that HTML by default gives us some validation. And that's because for this input field, we did say that the type is equal to email and that it is required. So although HTML does some validation, the UI is not really that good and we will want to customize it. So we can add some custom error handling for this as well. So let's just enter an email and let's enter a password and click on sign in. And we see that we have a custom error message over here. And that's because in the handle submit, before we submit, we are doing a validation of our own where we check if the password length is less than 10. And if it's not, we call set errors, which is another stateful variable over here. And once this is set to something, we render it out below our input fields. So errors.email and errors.password. Now, there are a few problems with this. Firstly, you have to keep track of another stateful variable, which is this errors variable on your own. And secondly, you have to do all of the validation on your own as well. There are pretty useful libraries out there which can do validation for you, where you call a simple function, and you don't have to be doing password checks like this manually by yourself. So let's enter a proper password over here, more than 10 characters. And when we click on the sign in button, you'll see a loading state and then it changes to sign in back. And that's because once we submit our API request, which we are doing over here, await fetch, before that we call a set submitting stateful variable and set that to true. And once we're done, we set it to false. And this is being tracked by this stateful variable over here. And what this can basically allow us to do is render out the text inside a login button. And if we are submitting, we call a loading text, otherwise a sign in text. And we also disable this button while we're submitting. Because usually when you're making API calls through a button, you don't want to let the user submit again by mistake. So you disable the button while it's submitting. Again, it's the same issue where you have another stateful variable which you have to keep track of, and it can lead to errors. Now this does get the job done with a simple form like this, but with larger forms, your custom code can get a lot to manage and is prone to bugs. For example, if you need to add a phone number field, we need to add another input, add it to the state, add our own validation and clear it as well, which is a lot of repeated code. But what if I told you there was a React library which would cut the code in less than half using a single React hook? This is where React Hook Form comes in, which as you can see is a pretty popular library. It manages form state for us and easily integrates with validation libraries like Zod, which we'll also be using. It also has much better user experience and performance than if you would implement your own form. So with that being said, let's check out the code. So over here, I have the same exact form with the email and the password, but I removed all the use state and error and everything. So we just have the markup. And that's because we don't need any of that. The library will take care of that for us. So before we get started, we need to come down here in the terminal and say npm install react hook form. And once that's done, we can do npm run dev again. Now, the first thing we need to do before we create our form is to add the type for our form. By the way, I'm using TypeScript in this tutorial, but if you're using JavaScript, you can still follow along. Just don't add the typing that I'll be adding and you'll be fine. So I'll say type form is equal to, and this is just so that React Hook Form can keep a track of the different fields we have in our form. So the two fields we have is email, which is a string, and we have password, which is a string as well. Now to create our form, we will just say const form is equal to use form, which will be imported from React Hook Form. And what this essentially means is that we've created a new instance of a form, and all of the data for our form, the state, errors, and everything will be tracked inside this variable over here. Since we're working in TypeScript, let's add the type of the form, which is the form type which we just created, and save that. Now we've created the form, but we need to actually attach it to all of the input fields that we have. And to do that, instead of using this variable over here, we'll destructure it. And the first thing we want to get out of it is a function called register. What register helps us to do is attach all of these inputs to our form, which is being kept track of using the use form. So the first input which we'll register is input. And the syntax for this is you add curly braces, you call register. The first parameter is which input field you would like to register, which is email. And we're getting that because we added the form type to our form. And that's it for now. And what you need to do is you need to get out the value from this function and spread it out. So what happens is when the page renders, it calls the register function immediately. It gets back an object, and then it spreads it out onto our input field. So our email field has been attached. Let's do the same thing with our password field. So we'll go down here, register, and this time we'll register the password field and save that. So obviously the input field and the password field work as before, but we want to check if our form is actually keeping track of what we enter. And to do that, let's create the submit function. So we'll go to the top over here and say const on submit. We'll add the type. If you're using JS, don't add the type. The type will be submit handler from React Hook form, and it will be of type form, which we have defined ourselves at the top. This will be a function which takes in the email and the password, and then let's just console.log the email and the password. Now you'll see one difference between this and our previous onSubmit function is that the previous one actually took in the submit event, while in this we're just directly taking in the data. And that's because we have a function inside your React Hook form called handle submit. And the way we attach it to our form is say for the form on submit, what you want to do is call the handle submit function, and inside that call on submit, which we have defined. So what happens is when your page renders, the handle submit function is called directly. It adds a wrapper around your own onSubmit function, and it basically does all of the validation for you before you actually call this onSubmit function. So say for example, your email validation is throwing an error. It'll catch that before it calls your own onSubmit function. So now that we've saved that, let's just try to test it out. Let's enter any email that we have over here and any password. And we'll make this a proper email and click on sign in. So we can see that the React Hook form is actually keeping track of the variables, and the submit is working as well. And one thing, if you don't know this, when you have a form and you have an on submit, what you need to do is put a button inside this and say type is equal to submit, and React will automatically recognize that you're trying to submit this form. And just an extra bit of information, this handle submit function is something called as a higher order function in React. And what higher order functions are functions which take a function as an input, add some stuff to it, and return back another function. Not really important for this, but it's good to know if you're a React developer. So now we have a basic form which keeps track of two input fields, much lesser code. But let's try to add some validation and see how that works. So the easiest way to add some validation is go to the register function. And the second parameter that you have over here takes in some rules that you have for this input field. So for the email, we can say that required is true. And since we're adding that, let's just remove the required is equal to true from the input field itself and save that. And now if we refresh the page and open up the logs, if we try to enter it like this, let's just add some password. If we try to enter it like this, it won't show the submit function because it's not submitting anything, because the validation of required is true is leading to an error. You can add more properties. So let's go to the password and give it an object and say min length and set that equal to 10. So let's add an email at abc.com and let's add a password which is less than 10 characters and click on sign in. You'll see that nothing shows up again because it's not submitting. Let's also put required as true on this. So that's our validation. I know we're not logging the errors out right now on the UI, but we'll get to that. But if you want to check out any other rules that a React Hook form offers you, there's max length and many others. You can check out the documentation. So we have the validations, but they're kind of useless if we don't let the user know what the errors are. So to actually extract the errors that we're getting inside our form, we can say form state and extract the errors field from that. Now, whenever you have an error in any input, it'll be assigned to this errors object over here, and then you can use that. So let's try to render it out. So below the input, we'll add curly braces and say errors.email and render out a p tag. Give it a class name of text red 500. This is Tailwind, by the way. You don't need to use it. I'm just using it for this project. And then say errors.email.message and log that out. Let's do the same thing for the password. So we'll go below the password input and say password for both of these fields. Okay, let's try to sign in. And we see that we aren't actually seeing any errors. And that's because we have to tell React Hook Form what to show whenever a validation fails. So firstly, we'll go to our email field and we see that we've just said required is equal to true. But if you want to render out something as an error message, you will say, please enter an email and save that. And now if you click on sign in, we see the error message logged out. Let's do the same thing for the password. So again, for required, it's true, but we'll say, please enter a password. Click on sign in. Let's enter an email and let's enter a password which is less than 10 characters and sign in. And you'll see it actually didn't log out anything because the submit function is being called. But we also don't get an error, and that's because min length hasn't been assigned a message. But it has a number assigned to it already. So how do we do this? We actually assign an object to it, set the value is equal to 10, and then say the message should be equal to password must be at least 10 characters and save. Now if we click on sign in, we get the message as well. Let's make it more than 10 characters, sign in, and we see that it's actually logged out. Now, of course, this is very basic validation. So if we do try to click on sign in, it works right now. But if we remove the email and click on sign in, it's still the default HTML checking if it's an email or not. But if you want to have your own error message for this, we'll get to that later on, where we check more powerful validation libraries. So now we know how to do validations and render error messages. The next thing we're going to take a look at is how to manually get and set the fields inside your form. Because right now the only way to modify this email and password is to actually enter it in the input yourself. But there are certain cases where you might want to get the value inside your email input field, which you can only do right now inside the onSubmit. So in our example, what we're going to do is take the live value of this email input field and render it out after this welcome back message. It doesn't make sense right now, but when you're working on forms, it might be useful. So basically what we want to do is watch what the email's value is currently. There's an easy way to do that. We call the watch function from useForm and say const email is equal to watch. And now we can just go before the exclamation mark over here and render out the email. And now you'll see whenever I change the input field, it gets changed on top over here inside the heading as well. Another thing you might want to do is not keep track of a value as it changes, but whenever a function is called, you want to get a value of a certain input field. For that, we use the get values function. And over here, let's just console.log out get values result and get values. So open up the logs, enter an email and a password, and click on sign in. And you can see that the get values function returns as an object with the email and the password. So if you want to call a function and you want to get the values inside your form, you can call this function. And lastly, you might want to externally set the value of your input field. So say, for example, you click on onSubmit and you want to clear out the values. For that, we use the set value function. We'll go over here and say set value. For the email, we'll set that to an empty string, and set value for the password, we'll set that to an empty string as well. Save that. And now let's enter an email and password and sign in. And it'll be cleared out automatically because of the set value that we got. And one last thing, if you want to have default values inside the input fields, what you can do is inside useForm, add an object, give it a parameter of default values, and say that the email should be example@example.com and save that. And if we refresh, you'll see that it pre-renders this value inside your field. We won't be using that, but you can keep that if you want. By the way, if you've learned something new, consider subscribing and join the Discord server linked in the description to connect with developers like yourself and join the community. Now, if you're making a form, chances are that you want to send this data to your backend via an API request. And to do that, whenever you submit a form, instead of just having a normal on submit, you want to turn it into an async on submit. Because all requests to an API are async and you don't know when you'll get the data back. Next, what we'll do is delete these set values and actually make a fetch request. So we're going to await a fetch request to this URL. We'll send in some data using this object. Then we'll turn that response into a JSON. We'll log out data submitted, and then we'll empty out the fields. So let's save that and open up the console. Let's enter an input for the email, something for the password, sign in. And we see that after a small delay, we get data submitted. So we can see that with a minor change, we can actually make async requests to our API. And this truly shows the power of React Hook Form. Now, one thing is whenever somebody submits a form, you want the button to be disabled until the value is returned back from the API. And to know if the form value is still being submitted, we'll go to the form state and get back is submitting. And then we just go to the bottom to our sign in field and we'll say disabled is equal to is submitting. And then we'll also say that the value we render out inside the button is conditional. So if is submitting, then render out loading ... And what this means is that React Hook Form is keeping track of whether an API request is still going on or if it's been successful. All of it is handled for you, and if you weren't using the library, you would have had to manage the state for this yourself. So now let's add an email and a password. Click on sign in. You see the loading state, it clears out, and then we see data submitted. Now, another thing is that if your fetch request actually sends back an error, you might want to show that on your UI. So let's take a look at how to actually manually set errors in your form. Obviously, the first thing you do is go over here and get the set error function. Now we'll wrap our await fetch inside a try catch. So I'll just say try catch and move the await fetch inside here. And then just to simulate an error before the set values, I'll say throw new error. Then inside the catch section, we'll say set error. We'll set it on neither the email or the password because this is overall for the entire form. So we'll set it on the root of the form. And then the message will be the data could not be submitted. And we'll save that. Now, obviously, we're not rendering out the roots error anywhere. So we'll just take the email error message over here, go in above the label over here and say errors.root.message and put a question mark there. And if it does exist, we'll say errors.root.message and render that out. So let's try to submit something to the form. We click on sign in, loading, and then we're throwing the error. So the error gets thrown and we get the message the data could not be submitted. And there should be C over here. So we've seen how to do validations and error management inside React Hook Form, but we were doing all of the validation by ourselves. But that's not the recommended way. The recommended way is to use a validation library like Zod, which handles the validation for you. It's one of the most popular libraries, as you can see by the weekly downloads over here, and it integrates really well with React Hook Form. So I've just gone and made a copy of our form again. I haven't made any change yet. So what you need to do is go into the terminal and you need to write npm install Zod, and then you also need to add hook form / resolvers. And the second library basically lets React Hook Form integrate with different resolver libraries like Zod. So we'll go back into npm.dev, close the console over here. So how Zod works is that using Zod, you define the schema of your form. So we'll go over here and say const form schema is equal to z, import that from Zod, and it'll be an object. Inside we'll have an email field. We'll again use z and say it is a string, so z.string. And we'll also say it's an email, so we'll attach a .email to the end of that. For the password, we'll say it's a z.string, and we'll say .min of 10. So by doing this, we basically told Zod, this is the two fields that we're going to have in our form. They're both going to be strings. One is going to be an email, and for the other one, it should have a minimum length of 10. If we ever submit an input and it doesn't match these requirements, just throw an error for us. So the schema has been defined. And the great thing is that if you define a schema, you don't need to define your own type like this. You can say z.infer type of form schema and close that. Now we've defined the schema, but we need to connect it to our React hook form. And the way we do that is we go over here and we say resolver is equal to Zord resolver. And we are getting that from that hook form resolvers library which we installed. And then we'll pass in the form schema. And that's basically letting React hook form know that for validation, basically use this schema that we've defined. Now, since we are adding validation via Zord, we can remove our previous validation. So over here for the email, we'll remove this object that we had. We can also remove type is equal to email, just so we can see our own custom validation for email. And similarly for password, we'll remove this huge object which we have, and we'll still keep type is equal to password so that we can't see the text over here, and save. Let's try to sign in. And we get some default messages from Zord, such as invalid email, and the string must contain at least 10 characters. So let's add this email and just some input over here. And you'll see that the message also updates live. You don't have to click on submit. It keeps track of it live for you. And we click on sign in, loading. Of course, we get the error because we didn't change that, but we can just remove the error that we have over here and save. Now, if you do want some custom messages for your validation instead of the default Zord ones, we'll go to the password, and as a second parameter, we can just say message, and we'll say password must be at least 10 characters. And for email, we can also say message, please enter a valid email, and save that. Let's refresh and click on sign in. And now we see our custom messages are being rendered out as well. So Zord has loads of different validations like this, and it makes form validation a lot easier for you. You just define the schema and you don't need to keep track of anything else by yourself. So that's about it. We learned how React Hook Form can make creating and managing forms a lot easier, and even so how to do better validations using Zord. If you didn't understand anything, just go through the video once more and it'll make a lot more sense. And if you liked the video, do leave a like and comment down below what topic you'd like me to cover next. Thanks for watching.